Colleagues, we are going to move to figure. We're going to recognize David Odhiambo, who's a curator of African Pharmaceutical Network based in Kenya. We started off in our introduction by speaking about how the whole AMA project was launched, or rather was conceptualized at the back of a 2005 Abuja summit that the heads of states of the African Union sanctioned that a pharmaceutical manufacturing plan ought to be developed and advanced. And really central to the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan is the local production of pharmaceuticals. So we look forward to David closing the loop for us in terms of our understanding of the AMA as well as AMRH and how that really relates to what had been the real purpose and object at conceptualization, that being local production of pharmaceuticals. David, please take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I hope you guys can hear me and can see my screen well. So as has been introduced, I'm Odhiambo David. I'm a pharmacist by profession and the curator of Africa Pharmaceutical Network. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about, as has been suggested, is looking at the expected impact of African Medicines Agency on the local pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa. I'll just give a background of what we do at Africa Pharmaceutical Network as I get into the gist of the discussion today. And generally, Africa Pharmaceutical Network is a non-profit initiative that's focused on bringing together players in the African pharmaceutical sector for sharing knowledge, policy shaping, and nurturing innovative ideas that will ensure that the principal thing that we're looking at all at the same time is ensuring Africans can have access to quality, safe, and reliable medical products, at the same time the pharmaceutical care that they need. So how do we ensure that the people who are playing within that industry are able to achieve this? And this is the critical mission that we try to drive with the African Pharmaceutical Network. And at the end of the session, I'll share a link to the LinkedIn group that we share as well, so that we can collaborate and share some of the ideas that we can nurture moving forward. So that is the background of what I'm looking at. So from the presentations that have been made, we know African Medicines Agency, it's a project that has been the making for a long time for now, starting from 2007, where there was the development of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa. Then from the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa, the impediments that were realized were issues around regulation. And with that, in 2009, there was the establishment of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Framework. And this led to the establishment of the Regional Economic Community Harmonization Frameworks. We have the ESC, West Africa, SADC, Zazibona, and a couple of other initiatives which are looking at harmonizing regional regulation of medicines and medical products. So that has been the background of what we are looking at up to the point where now we have the African Medicines Agency. So this is a treaty that is supposed to be signed and adopted, ratified by the different member countries. And at the end of the day, it has an agenda of ensuring that we have harmonized regulation that will enable us to achieve the principal product of quality, safe, and affordable healthcare products to the African people that are addressing the public health needs of these populations. So that is why we need all these African Medicines Agency, and that is what the argument has been around. So in terms of what presentation that already had been made as well by Bakani, and what the other people I talk about, we're looking at the focus of AMA was coordinate ongoing regulatory system, strengthen and harmonize the efforts of the African recognized regional economic community, regional health authorities, and member states. Then providing regulatory guidance that is from the organizations that are already having established frameworks of regulatory structures to ensure that this information is going to support in terms of ensuring we have a robust regulatory system in the continent. Having looked at that in the context of local pharmaceutical manufacturing, this was envisioned in 2007 when heads of state and government endorsed that plan, and that is anchored on the IU NEPAD. And the most focused angle was ensuring reliable access to essential medicine, contributing to economic and social development through job creation, foreign exchange, and related other incentives.
People don't know that principle.
For Africa. So then finally we're looking at the strengthening of healthcare systems. So with local pharmaceutical manufacturing, the angles that were being looked at by the heads of state and the different agencies that were involved in development of the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa. And those are some of the drivers on it, are in looking at it in terms of how can we ensure that Africans and residents of the African continent are able to access quality pharmaceutical products. That's the first thing, to ensure that the unmet healthcare needs in the continent are going to be met. Beyond meeting those healthcare needs through continuous and reliable access to quality medicines, it was being looked at in terms of the economic incentive that it was going to bring. With local pharmaceutical manufacturing, there were jobs to be created. That was one bit of it. And other than the jobs, we would get to the point of exporting pharmaceutical products as a continent. And with that, there would be the foreign exchange component of it that was also very important. Then another thing that is critical is in terms of building the infrastructure and industrialization capacity of Africa. And this is something that is already even now being driven as a continent, and different countries are taking lead in different perspectives. For example, Ethiopia has developed a blueprint that is going to drive the pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity in the country. And these are majorly looking at how do we industrialize, because with industrialization, we're improving our productivity as a country, we're promoting economic productivity, then that means increased level standards of living for individuals. So those were all the different components that were being looked into in terms of the local pharmaceutical manufacturing. So as we move from that bit of it, then we now need to ask ourselves, what would be the incentive? Because we are talking about it from the perspective of what would be the benefit of having pharmaceutical manufacturing contextualized and being promoted within our local context as Africans within the African continent. But then what would happen and what would make an individual want to invest in pharmaceutical manufacturing in Africa? The first critical bit that would look at it from an investor perspective as a pharmaceutical manufacturer would be, what's the market size? What need are we addressing in this particular market? We acknowledge that we have unmet healthcare needs in Africa. Africa has the largest proportion of communicable diseases, that is in terms of disease burden. And even with the changing epidemiological profile moving towards the non-communicable diseases, there's still a growing disease burden, which is not being met because we don't have the capacity in terms of medical supplies and production to meet them, and even the economic status now in terms of the market size. How many people are able to finance that healthcare? And what are the financing models that are being put in place to ensure that that market size is lucrative enough for a pharmaceutical manufacturer or an investor to invest in pharmaceutical manufacturing within the continent? So those would be the initial incentives that we look at from what would be what the manufacturer be looking at. The other bit will be now on the ease of doing business. For somebody to venture into a particular territory to do their pharmaceutical manufacturing and do their production, they need to look at the regulations. What are the regulatory framework that are guiding the operations in that particular market? We look at it in the current segregated framework that we have in the continent, with regulation of medicines and healthcare products being done by national medicines regulatory agencies, and some of them are actually domiciled within the Ministries of Health with limited capacity. So it means these regulations either are not as effective as they should be, and in some cases, there are restraints that are also there. So if they are not conducive enough for somebody to access that market, they're prohibitive, then it means not many people will be investing in those territories. And that is one of the critical things that we've been facing as a continent in promoting local pharmaceutical manufacturing, the regulatory shortfalls. And at the same time, on the same note, when we look at it from the African Medicines Agency, the critical bit would be, with the harmonized regulatory framework, what would be the value and what are the costs that are associated with that? Would it be, it's a trade-off. What is the opportunity cost that we have to cater for in terms of dealing with the local authority or not? Then the policies that are guiding that, what are the government directives and incentives that are driving that? For example, I would talk about the Kenyan framework now, where we're looking at it as universal healthcare coverage as a priority agenda of the country. And with universal healthcare coverage, there is need to ensure that everybody has access to the quality medicine. So government would be, let's say, for example, providing incentives in terms of subsidies, quotas, favorable terms for purchasing from local pharmaceutical manufacturers. And those are making it easier for an individual who would want to invest to look at investing in that particular territory. Then in terms of the third incentive that I highlighted here, it's on the cost of production. So if for a country we have the cost of production being so high, however much we would look at promoting seamless regulatory frameworks and all, the cost of production would be prohibitory. And when it's prohibitive, then it means nobody's going to invest, however much we try to push that. So the basis of bringing on board this particular slide on incentives is to look at it from an investor perspective. We need to look at it from addressing the healthcare needs of our people, but at the same time look at what are the other building blocks, what are the other drivers that would enable us to move from a point of looking at how do we meet these needs, because it's the essential need, but how do we ensure that every other person who is playing within that ecosystem, within that environment, is able to derive value and create value for that entire system to be continuous and sustainable as it should be. So that is on the incentive bit of it. Then now with African Medicines Agency, the angle that it brings is in terms of harmonized regulations, ease of introducing medicines into the larger markets without extra bottlenecks. For example, when we talk about harmonized regulation, it means with the different regional economic harmonization framework, let's say the East Africa communities, as the Bona framework, the SADC framework, all these, it means once a product has been reviewed in a particular, within the particular regional economic community, then it means it should be recognized and adopted to be given market authorization in that particular country with lesser time frame that would be required in that case, and that would be an ease. And if we have this harmonized framework, then it means for the 55 African countries that we have, it would make it easier for us to introduce a product in any part of the continent if the AMA comes into play. And if that comes into play, a population of 1.2 billion in Africa, that is a large market enough, considering we know the disease burden is already as high as it should be. So that is a market business incentive. So that would be a positive of the AMA. Then the wider market, room for exploitation of idle production capacity. We acknowledge that we have some pharmaceutical manufacturing companies in Africa, and some of these are not operating at capacity. Reason being, either they're not having sufficient market access levels, which is making them not get into exploiting that extra capacity in their production levels. Other than that, the other detriment, another challenge that some of these companies are facing is in terms of the financial, the other cost factor, the incentives. The cost factors are so high, so investing in that production would not be appropriate. And at the same time, when we look at the timelines that are being taken for registration of a product, averagely in the continent, we are talking about 18 months to 24 months. So that is one and a half a year to 2 years. So if that all that time is going to be taken to introduce a product into a particular market, and then at the same time you look at the people that you're going to access in that market, it's lower compared to what you would have dealt with in a harmonized framework. So it means that would be a bottleneck and a restraint. But in this case, with the harmonized framework, we are looking at wider markets, improved competency of the workforce in terms of capacity building, and local pharmaceutical manufacturing, including research and development. And that is one of the things that have been actually indoctrinated in the AMA Treaty and the MRH, its stakeholder in terms of the Secretariat capacity building framework. So those are some of the positives that we look at it. But what are the risks of it? With the harmonized framework, then it means every other person, it is not only going to be focused on the local pharmaceutical manufacturers in Africa. And that again brings you back to the initial presentation that I had on the incentives. If the cost of production is high, then it means even the products that we're going to produce within the continent are going to be higher. And then we have countries and regions that have got the advantage in terms of cost of production, the economies of scale. It means there would be influx of cheaper imports with the harmonized regulations, which are accessing more of the markets. And therefore, that would not drive the interest of local manufacturing that we are keen on ensuring we achieve. Another thing was in the lengthy registration process. And even now, when we're talking about the regional economic communities having their different harmonization frameworks in place, there is still a challenge because it takes longer than it would have been envisioned. It had been envisioned, that is the first thing. And other than taking longer, in some of the cases, you find a product has been reviewed in a particular within the framework, and at the same time, some of the member countries are not recognizing that kind of report, that approval that is already given. So if a country doesn't recognize it, it means, and as a local pharmaceutical manufacturer or a new player in the market, I have to go through the entire process once again. That affects the overall access of my product in the market. So we need to look at it from, with African Medicines Agency being brought into place, what would be the values? And then what do we need? For example, at this particular moment, there's a broad idea and a very ambitious vision of how African Medicines Agency should come into play, but we haven't looked at the very nitty-gritty details of how are we going to operationalize it? And is it within the context of Africa that we're going to achieve this, or what other modalities do we need to put in place? And that is where some of the questions that have been raised in the previous discussions are very critical for us as players within the industry to look at in terms of, we know we need this African Medicines Agency. It's a good product for us, a good framework that we need. But at the same time, how do we ensure that it's enforceable? Because AU as an organization doesn't have the overriding mandate over the different countries. So it doesn't happen. It depends on goodwill. How do we build that goodwill then? Because once we know how we can drive that agenda as a continent, as the stakeholders within the market, we are going to be able to achieve that. And as I finalize, the last thing that we acknowledge actually from the presentation that was made by Greg, there's that need for mutual recognition and building trust. And one of the critical challenges we are facing as a continent, as stakeholders within the pharmaceutical industry, is that initiatives and agendas are being driven from a perspective of, we have high level political goodwill at one point or not, which is driving it positively well. And at the same time, we are looking at a bottom-up approach where we are looking at what are the needs at that particular moment. But the challenge and the gap that we have is stakeholders within the industry are not actively engaged in driving these different initiatives and different agendas. You realize that we have local pharmaceutical manufacturers who are waiting to adopt the framework once it's been already rolled out. But who is going to build momentum and lobby for its implementation with the right requirements of what is needed? So far, most of us are not playing an active role in ensuring we drive the policy forming, the operationalization of these frameworks. And that is why even when they are already established, there's a challenge in ensuring they meet the needs of the market. And when they're not responsive to market needs, after a period of time, let's say 2 to 5 years, they become obsolete and we'll jump to the next initiative. 2007, Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan for Africa. 2009, African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Framework. We moved to the different regional economic community harmonization framework, the ESCs, Azibon, and all that. Currently, even the ESC is kind of almost closing down. And it's because we start with the impetus and that motivation and the zeal to drive that agenda. But at the end of the day, we don't bring our input to ensure that it is sustainable enough that's going to get us where we need to get to. So that is very, very critical for us. And as members of this discussion, the 41 people that we have in the meeting room for now, it would be my call that let's play our part. And in playing our part, let's give our contributions. Let's look at it from a broad perspective rather than looking at AMA as a single entity, as a single product by itself. With that, we are able to drive a common agenda that would help us develop the local pharmaceutical manufacturing. And if not, it ensures that we have a responsive and efficient pharmaceutical system for the African people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. I don't see any questions. In the meantime, as people are possibly putting across their questions, I would like to ask David, in terms of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that became operational as of the 1st of January 2021, how do you see that opening markets, especially you made a point earlier that there are pharmaceutical companies operating in Africa that are not running at full capacity. How can we leverage in the context of local production of pharmaceuticals, in the context of pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa? How can we leverage the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to fill up capacity at our factories?
Thank you. So in terms of one, leveraging the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, it's a good move and it's a good framework in terms of ensuring we open up trades and ensure we have a common economy and a common economic bloc for an African continent, which is good at this particular moment. But when you look at it has been structured, it's going to drive an agenda, but what are the components of it that are driving the pharmaceutical industry? Or let's say that are inclined to ensuring we drive the production of pharmaceuticals in it, or even the trade of pharmaceuticals as much. It hasn't been given that kind of zeal and push that it needs. So it therefore means it would depend on an individual investor to look at what value does it have on it that is going to help us in terms of driving our pharmaceutical framework. So what would be my take? My take would be in terms of, we have the framework that is the treaty that is already in place, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is okay, it has been signed by member countries. But then the players within the industry, we need to look at it in terms of how many countries have the relevant capacity to produce pharmaceuticals for the continent. What kind of incentives and investments do we need in these markets to ensure they're able to produce up to capacity? and what are the market needs in terms of disease burden and the shortfalls in market medicine supplies. Then that kind of forms an intersection where the products being supplied will be meeting the needs, and then with the free trade and the relaxed economic trade barriers that we have, then it now makes it easier for a robust pharma industry to thrive at this point.
Thank you so much, David.
Pharma industry playing an active role in that kind of a trade engagement.
Yes. All right. No, thank you very much.